Welcome to Geneva Press Club. Ce lundi, aujourd'hui même, s'ouvre officiellement à Davos, en Suisse, la 54e édition du Forum économique de Davos, le WEF. En plus de centaines de dirigeants économiques, plus de 60 chefs d'État et de gouvernement y sont annoncés. L'occasion parfaite pour le Club suisse de la presse de questionner un domaine qui nous tient à cœur, un volet essentiel de la finance contemporaine qui, nous espérons, sera également au cœur des discussions au WEF, la finance durable et ses avancées. Alors c'est une évidence, la finance verte est un levier pour relever les défis écologiques et économiques. Le système financier joue un rôle important dans la réalisation des objectifs climatiques et de développement durable. De plus, améliorer le niveau de vie dans le monde ne peut se faire que si l'environnement et les ressources naturelles sont prises en compte. Mais au moment où l'ONG Oxfam publie un rapport qui dénonce l'accroissement des inégalités mondiales entre 2020 et 2023, au moment où près de 60% des économistes en chef sondés par le Forum économique mondial cette année anticipent un recul de la croissance économique, prendre en compte l'environnement, le bien-être social et une bonne gouvernance dans le domaine financier, est-ce déjà une réalité ou est-ce encore une utopie? Est-on sur le bon chemin de cette finance durable indispensable à une bonne gouvernance mondiale? Est-ce que les critères, ces fameux critères ESG, environnementaux, sociaux et de gouvernance, sont-ils désormais un réflexe dans les décisions commerciales ou d'investissement? La place financière suisse est elle-même un exemple en la matière. Alors, nous sommes heureux ici ce matin au Club suisse de la presse de faire un point sur le sujet avec 3 personnalités engagées et impliquées dans le développement durable à des échelles différentes. Tout d'abord, Rebeca Grynspan. Rebeca, welcome. Thank you for being here today at Geneva Press Club. You're just on your way to Davos. Rebeca Grynspan est la secrétaire générale de la conférence des Nations Unies sur le commerce et le développement, la CNUCED. Rebeca, you'll be speaking in English today. You were appointed the 8th Secretary General of the UN Conference on Trade and Development in 2021, and you are the first woman to hold this position in the history of the organization, which is, of course, a very important and good sign for this organization. You are an economist. You also were vice president of Costa Rica. Alors, rappelons que la CNUCED, la Conférence des Nations Unies sur le commerce et le développement, est un organe de l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies, créé en 1964 déjà, qui vise à intégrer les pays en développement dans l'économie mondiale de façon à favoriser leur essor, et que la CNUCED est justement là pour aider les pays en développement à accéder de manière plus équitable, efficacement aux avantages d'une économie dite mondialisée. À sa droite, M. Derek Queisser de Stockalper, bienvenue. Vous êtes économiste, ambassadeur auprès du CyberPeace Institute. Vous êtes également le fondateur de Quanalytics. C'est une plateforme d'investissement d'impact et un groupe de réflexion développant des solutions de recherche, d'analyse, d'investissement pour aider à faciliter l'émergence d'une véritable économie sociale. Vous avez publié différents essais, différents livres sur le sujet, notamment sur le concept de réciprocité numérique. Monsieur Laurent Jimaja, à la gauche de Rebeca Grynspan. Monsieur Laurent Jimaja, bienvenue au Club suisse de la presse. Vous êtes président de SWISSAID-Genève. C'est à ce titre principalement que vous êtes avec nous aujourd'hui pour participer au débat. Vous êtes également depuis 2015 conseiller administratif vert du Grand-Saconnex. Vous présidez différentes autres organisations comme le FANG, la Fédération des associations des afrodescendants et des Noirs de Genève. Vous êtes également vice-président de l'Association des communes genevoises. Voilà encore un étage où on peut sans doute être utile en termes de finances durables. Et puis enfin, un membre du conseil d'administration de l'aéroport international de Genève. Messieurs, madame, merci infiniment d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Je passe la parole pour la modération du débat à Louisa Balin, collègue du Club suisse de la presse, qui va modérer ce débat. Louisa Balin, merci beaucoup pour l'invitation de ces panélistes. Je te passe la parole.
Merci Isabelle. Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui à ce débat. Je salue aussi tous ceux et celles qui nous suivent en ligne. C'est un plaisir pour moi de modérer ce débat. Si vous le permettez, je vais commencer avec Mme Grynspan et ensuite, messieurs, je m'adresserai à vous. Madam Secretary General, thank you very much for being with us today. My first question will be, what is for you and for UNCTAD, what does it mean when we speak about green finance or sustainable finance?
Well, thank you all very much. I am really pleased to be here. Happy New Year to everybody. We already forgot about the New Year. We started very intensely this 2024. First of all, let's be clear that when we talk about sustainable finance, it's different from talking about green finance. And maybe that's one of the things that we have to start with, because sustainability is not only environmental sustainability, it is also social and economic sustainability. Yeah? So when we talk about sustainable finance, we refer really more to the concept of the sustainable development paradigm, yes, to the sustainable development goals that has 3 pillars. That is the social, the economic, and the environmental pillar. And really the big challenge is how to make those compatible. How you can have the economic, the social, and the environment, you know, in the same space. You can enter policies and actions from each of these windows. But the thing is that we have to get to the same place. And that coherence is one of the main challenges that we face in development, yes? And it's part of the big discussion between, you know, the developing countries and the rest of the world, because they don't want to forget about the 3 pillars of sustainable development, and suddenly we talk only about green, and we talk about only the environmental part of it, and we need to bring along the economic and social aspects of it. That's my first point. My second point is that financing is, and I was talking precisely with my colleague, financing is not only capital markets, yes? You have multilateral development banks, and you have the international architecture for a green or sustainable and sustainable financing. You have all the commitments that you have done at the international level. So you have the 8 component and the commitments that have been done, for example, in Paris with respect to the green transition and helping and supporting developing countries to comply with it. And you have also the domestic resource mobilization. You know, you need also the domestic resource mobilization to be able to make sustainability possible. Well, and you have, as we were talking, the own financing of the international firms, that many times is much more than the GDP of one country. Yeah, so you have also their own investment to have to come to bear. You know, they have to be sustainable and they have to be green, also with their own resources. So all these aspects have to be taken into account to talk about, first of all, sustainable financing and also about green transition.
Thank you very much for the clarification. Would you say today that there is a progress or a setback concerning sustainable finance and green finance also?
And you remember that movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly? So, you know, the good is that I think that there has been a lot of progress. Yeah? a lot of awareness, more standards, more commitments from the private sector, from the international communities. There is a long way to go, but I think that society, civil society, citizenship, let's put it that way, global citizenship has been a big factor of this movement. And I think that has to be recognized because, as I say very often, you won't mobilize if you think that nothing is possible. You need to think that you can change reality, to mobilize the energy and the commitments that you need to change the present state of affairs. So first of all, a lot of progress. What I see as a setback is two things. One is that I think that the trust that we had in 2015 at the international level to agree on the SDGs and the Paris Agreement is not here anymore. That goodwill, that idea that there is a win-win in this agenda has weakened. And I think that is the main problem that we are facing. Because without trust, it will be very difficult to go forward. You need trust to agree, yes? And I think that trust has been weakened. The world is more polarized. And let me maybe put it this way, geopolitics has taken over. And there is nothing right now that is free from the geopolitical game. In the past, in the international community, we fought very hard to have these spaces where the merits were in the objectives and not on the politics of it. Humanitarian law, for example, yes, or development. So we fought very strongly for these spaces to be free of different objectives that these spaces had themselves. Save lives or fight poverty and inequality. But now you see that geopolitics is everywhere. It's in the humanitarian, it's in the development, it's in the technology. Everywhere, geopolitics has in a way taken a lot of the oxygen and the space that was free before. And I think that is a challenge for this agenda because we need to rebuild trust and rebuild the bridge also between the North and the South for this agenda to be successful.
I will come back to you in a few minutes concerning political will and trust. And now I turn to a very inspiring personality of the civil society. You have mentioned the importance of civil society. Et je me tourne maintenant vers vous, Monsieur Laurent Jimaja. Vous êtes ici, comme le disait notre directrice Isabelle Falconier, à double titre, je dirais. Vous êtes président de SWISSAID-Genève. Vous êtes aussi, et vous serez pour la 4e fois, le maire du Grand-Saconnex, de la commune du Grand-Saconnex. Vous êtes en politique depuis plusieurs années. J'aimerais avoir votre avis concernant justement la finance verte. Vous êtes un élu vert, vous-même. Comment est-ce que vous réussissez à convaincre, je dirais, vos collègues et aussi les personnes, les donateurs de fonds, qu'il est important d'investir dans cette finance durable et verte?
Merci beaucoup, merci pour cette question, merci pour les mots que vous avez employés déjà, madame. C'est que la finance durable, plutôt, est un domaine d'avenir. On peut se dire que nous n'avons pratiquement plus besoin de faire quoi que ce soit. Tous les partis politiques sont convaincus de cela et la société civile est convaincue de cela. Et au niveau politique, au niveau local, on est aussi convaincu de cela. Il y a de grandes déclarations au niveau international, mais ces grandes déclarations ne sont pas suivies d'action. Et les citoyens ont pris quelque part le lead là-dessus et ont choisi eux-mêmes de mettre en place des mécanismes. Je vais en citer rapidement 2 qui sont relativement simples. C'est les monnaies locales, par exemple, pour financer l'économie locale, parce que le but de la finance durable, c'est surtout de redynamiser les économies locales aussi, mais d'avoir aussi de la transparence. Et si l'on observe à Genève, par exemple, nous avons la monnaie léman qui a été mise en place, même si elle n'a pas eu beaucoup de retentissement. Au Grand-Saconnex, nous avons adopté la monnaie léman. Nous sommes même un bureau de change de la monnaie léman. Et si vous prenez au plan international, parce que je ne pense pas qu'on pourra tout aborder, au plan international, vous avez parlé de géopolitique, effectivement, on observe également cela. Non seulement il y a les mouvements également de la société civile qui est interpellée par cette finance qui est tout le temps, qui est très spéculative, la finance dominante, hein, et qui dit, nous mettons en place également d'autres situations de financement participatif. Ça arrive. Et au plan international, on observe une rupture avec ce qui se passait depuis 1945, avec la Pax Americana. On a les BRICS qui se mettent en place et qui s'élargissent à d'autres pays. Et tout cela remet en cause tout ce que nous avons connu jusqu'à présent. Et au niveau de nos associations et de nos membres, on a principalement des personnes qui sont convaincues de tout cela et qui n'acceptent pas que l'on reçoive des financements de certaines entreprises, notamment l'industrie du tabac et puis l'industrie de l'armement. Et ces personnes financent les associations parce que nos associations vivent surtout de dons qui sont faits par des personnes physiques et des personnes morales. Je ne vais pas aller plus loin parce qu'il y a monsieur Derek Queisser aussi, qui est un spécialiste en la matière et qui certainement nous apportera plus de précision.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur Jimaja. Justement, je me tourne vers vous, monsieur Derek Queisser de Stockalper. La première fois que je vous ai rencontré, il y a quelques années, et que j'ai eu le plaisir de vous interviewer, vous m'avez dit, au fond, vous avez décidé de vous tourner vers la finance durable. Vous avez travaillé dans une banque à Londres, vous connaissez bien le monde de la finance. Pourquoi est-ce que vous vous y êtes intéressé, au fond, à cette finance durable et verte ?
Alors tout d'abord, un grand merci pour votre invitation, Louisa, au Club de la Presse. Merci pour vos interventions également. Alors c'est, je dirais, plutôt une approche philosophique. C'est-à-dire, il y a une vingtaine d'années, j'ai réalisé effectivement que le système actuel, disons, n'adressait pas forcément les besoins de l'individu ou de la communauté de manière constructive, ni même des écosystèmes plus larges. Et lorsque j'étais en charge de la stratégie d'un grand groupe industriel, j'ai proposé en fait une nouvelle stratégie, parce que je voulais l'intégrer dans l'opérationnel et non dans la phonotropie, une nouvelle stratégie que j'ai appelée innovation à travers la durabilité. Donc l'idée était effectivement d'utiliser une externalité négative, ce que disent les économistes, et là était effectivement la durabilité qui était le problème, et d'identifier de nouveaux marchés, produits, services qui pourraient adresser cette externalité négative. Donc en fait l'idée était comme un judoka, c'est d'utiliser la force du système en fait pour adresser ses propres faiblesses, et ceci dans une dialectique capitalistique, c'est-à-dire créer effectivement du profit, de la valeur, tout en adressant une problématique plus large. Donc ceci c'était il y a une vingtaine d'années, et ensuite cette réflexion a évolué dans le domaine de la finance où j'ai commencé à développer des thématiques liées sur d'autres types d'externalités qui m'ont permis ensuite effectivement de déployer d'autres types de solutions.
Alors, est-ce que lorsque on va chez son banquier, par exemple, est-ce qu'il vous propose, et que vous décidez d'investir, est-ce qu'il vous propose spontanément d'investir, je dirais, dans la finance durable et verte, ou bien est-ce qu'on est, nous, obligés de lui poser la question? En d'autres termes, est-ce que les loups de Wall Street, par exemple, vont intervenir ou vont décider d'investir dans la finance durable ou verte, ou bien est-ce que c'est simplement une niche quelque part de personnes qui sont déjà sensibles à cette question de la durabilité?
Alors je dirais que nous sommes en pleine transition. Au départ, c'était une niche, c'était un narratif, c'était un feel-good factor, et c'est là où effectivement la dimension ESG était utile pour essayer de comprendre si effectivement nous allions investir dans une société qui savait se comporter, entre guillemets, selon ses préceptes ou non. C'est un peu comme nettoyer devant sa porte, je dirais. Ce que nous avons vu maintenant depuis 2-3 ans, qui est très intéressant, c'est quelque chose de beaucoup plus fondamental, à 2 niveaux. Si vous allez chez votre banquier, tout dépend qui vous êtes et quel type d'investissement vous avez besoin. Donc, est-ce que vous allez investir dans des produits traditionnels? Est-ce que vous devez gérer votre risque? Ou est-ce que vous avez, disons, des opportunités peut-être plus sophistiquées? Alors, les 2 points qui sont en train d'émerger sont, un, au niveau du type, disons, d'investissement. Donc, il y a le côté coté et le côté non coté. Et là, dans le domaine non coté, beaucoup de choses se passent. Pourquoi? Parce que vous investissez dans de nouvelles technologies, modèles d'affaires, très en amont. Donc, vous pouvez soutenir des technologies qui pourraient faire une différence. Et deuxièmement, il y a ce que j'appellerais, disons, l'approche plus risque au niveau de l'allocation de vos actifs dans un portfolio. Et là, effectivement, la décorrélation devenait quelque chose de très intéressant. Certaines personnes commencent à y réfléchir. Mais je dirais qu'il y a quelque chose de plus fondamental qui est en train d'arriver. Et là, au lieu de faire du bottom-up, je vais faire du top-down. C'est-à-dire que l'environnement régulatoire, les règles du jeu sont en train de changer. Et celles-ci vont amener à l'émergence de nouveaux types de solutions, produits financiers, allocations, stratégies d'allocation de ressources. Et je prends 2 exemples, par exemple, c'est TNFD et TCFD, qui sont 2, effectivement, frameworks qui émergent du monde de la finance pour essayer non seulement d'identifier, disons, le rendement financier, mais également l'impact sur le climat ou maintenant, depuis quelques mois, sur la biodiversité. Et si nous avons ce data, cela nous donnera la plateforme pour faire des choses très intéressantes.
Alors, je me tourne à nouveau vers vous, Madame la Secrétaire générale. Vous irez tous les deux, vous, Monsieur Queisser de Stockalper, et vous, Madame la Secrétaire générale, demain au Forum de Davos. Le Forum de Davos qui est évidemment un événement de portée mondiale, non seulement économique, mais aussi politique. Madame Secretary General, I'm asking you... Sorry? En anglais? Oui, je vais le dire, justement. I was going to ask the question in English. Can you please explain us what is the interaction between the economy and politics vis-à-vis the sustainable finance? How can you explain? You are Secretary General of the UNCTAD. You have also been Vice President of your country, so you know perfectly, I would say, the dynamic of the politics. Can you explain us the interaction between the two, please?
Yeah. First, can I say something about what the former panelist said? First of all, I think that it's very important that you brought about the Pax Americana. It's the end of it. We are at the end of it. And it's true that if we are talking about public goods, global public goods, like sustainability or the transition is, so you need a governance structure that will be inclusive and also that will reflect the world of today, not the world of 1945. Yes, and that is part of the discussion that the South is having with the North. Many of the countries that are today independent were not even born in 1945. Yes, and they say, well, we need a system that will include our voice in a more effective way than the one that we have today. So governance, and you know, to answer to your question, governance is politics. Yes, and governance has to reflect the world of today and the objectives that we have put to ourselves. That inclusive voices is part of it, and so it has to be part of the political agenda at the global level. And this is true for the Bretton Woods institutions, and this is true for the UN. Yes, that have to really change and transform themselves to reflect the world of today. My second point, referring to what Derek said, is that I agree with Derek that you need to use the system to rechannel resources to this agenda. Now, a lot of that has happened. You know, there is a big market for the energy transition and for sustainability. The problem is that money is not getting to the developing countries or the least developed countries. Some of it is getting to the BRICS, to the big emerging economies, but to the LDCs, to the least developed countries, to the low-income countries, that money is not getting to
Why?
them. Because the risk perceived in these countries is very high, and their development challenges have to be addressed at the same time. Yes, there are governance issues, there are crisis issues, there are debt burden issues. So we have a problem of debt in many of the countries that have to make the transition. So they are faced with impossible choices. The number that we give internationally to understand the problem of debt with respect to development is that 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more in servicing the debt than on health or education. So you explain to me how they are going to make these investments. They cannot spend what they need in health and education. Most of a big portion of the revenues in terms of taxes or in terms of exports are going to servicing the debt, and the financial flows from the north to the south are not getting to them. Yes, last year the flows were negative or zero. Net flows were negative or zero. The investment, the foreign investment that goes to LDCs went down 16%, not up, down. So our problem is really, how do we build a platform that will allow the more vulnerable countries to receive the investment, the capital, the financing that they need to be able to make this transition possible? And this is about policies, and this is about politics. Yes, it's about the governance at the global level, because we have an international system that is very small to the task and has a lot of requirements. And so it's very difficult for these countries to navigate the system. But still, the World Bank needs to be recapitalized, and the IMF quotas needs to be increased because they are too small for the requirements and the challenges that we are facing today. Let me give you, and I will end with this, let me give you one number. The World Bank is today, to the world economy, 1/5 than what it was in 1960. 1/5. So in a way, we have reduced the international system for the private market to expand, but the private market is not going to where we needed to go. And so the equation of the private market taking over to solve the problems of development and the green and the sustainable transition has been flawed. We need all. We need the private market, we need the international financing, and we need the internal resource mobilization. If one of these legs is weak, we won't get to the objective that we have set to ourselves.
So I turn to Mr. Jimaja, precisely. Monsieur Jimaja, d'après ce que vient de dire Mme Grynspan, comment est-ce que cela se répercute, par exemple, sur des ONG qui soutiennent des projets dans les pays, justement, qui n'arrivent pas à obtenir ces financements? Comment est-ce que vous, à SWISSAID, vous arrivez, au fond, à travailler dans ces circonstances?
Faut dire que nous avons l'avantage de pouvoir être soutenus, nous, en ce qui concerne Genève, par la fédération. Nous sommes membres de la fédération genevoise de coopération qui est financée elle-même par les collectivités publiques. Mais j'ai envie de rebondir sur une chose, c'est que les ODD, les objectifs de développement durable, avaient indiqué 17 objectifs à atteindre, et la CNUCED, justement, avait déterminé qu'il fallait, je crois, 3 000 milliards à 7 000 milliards de dollars d'investissement par année pour pouvoir les atteindre. Et je ne pense pas que les ONG ou même les pays pauvres aient vu passer même 1% de ces estimations-là, parce que les enjeux mondiaux sont énoncés dans des forats comme Davos et autres, mais lorsqu'il s'agit de passer à la caisse, plus personne ne veut participer, et tous les problèmes que nous observons, à part le changement climatique qui nous impacte, nous tous, des problèmes de migration qui sont des problèmes liés au fait que les gens ne peuvent pas être heureux chez eux, les conditions ne le permettent plus, tous ces problèmes sont liés. Tout le monde le sait, en tout cas les personnes qui sont dans le domaine le savent, et les dirigeants qui devraient faire preuve de transparence et la gouvernance mondiale, si je puis me permettre, multilatérale, est totalement impuissante. Je ne sais pas qui devrait décider, mais nous, à notre petit niveau, nous arrivons à apporter quelques satisfactions à des organismes, à des organisations locales, parce qu'il s'agit de petits projets, c'est un peu le small is beautiful, donc on impacte les gens sur de petites actions, ils veulent cultiver, on leur donne les moyens de cultiver, on rend compte à nos bailleurs ici des actions qui sont menées, de toutes petites actions, parce que l'argent, le financement que nous obtenons nous le permet, et que nous devons rendre compte et à la Fédération genevoise de coopération, mais aussi à nos membres, et nous devons également informer les citoyens. On le fait. Malheureusement, il n'y a pas suffisamment de personnes qui sont informées de cela, et elles ne réagissent que sur la base de conséquences qu'elles observent à leur porte. Je les comprends, mais le problème est vraiment global.
Alors, je crois que vous devez nous quitter dans quelques minutes. Si vous voulez encore peut-être nous donner un exemple de comment on peut convaincre les décideurs du monde, au fond, de changer, de faire évoluer ce système. Qu'est-ce qu'il manque pour qu'il y ait cette volonté politique dont parlait Mme Grynspan et dont parlait aussi M. Queisser de Stockalper?
À mon niveau, je pense que ce qui manque, c'est un peu la médiatisation, informer les citoyens comme des actions aujourd'hui. Et cette discussion que nous sommes en train d'avoir, il faut que ça puisse être vulgarisé, parce que le citoyen moyen n'est pas forcément au courant de ce qui se passe au niveau international, il n'est pas au courant des actions que l'on peut mener à sa porte. Voyez-vous, lorsque vous pouvez financer des actions simples de développement local, M. Queisser le sait très bien, la finance nous permet également de fonctionner en vase clos si on le veut. Mais on nous a obligés à sortir du vase dans lequel on est pour pouvoir spéculer sur les transactions qu'il y a. Et il faut pouvoir remettre les choses en cause. Je ne pense pas que le niveau purement intellectuel et conceptuel puisse suffire. Il faudra une mobilisation encore plus forte de la société civile qui malheureusement s'essouffle également. Si vous voyez les jeunes, ils s'essoufflent, ils se battent, ils sont épuisés. Il faudra qu'on arrive à les dynamiser, à leur redonner de l'espoir, à oser nous dire nous-mêmes qu'il y a de l'espoir pour dire, comme d'autres le disaient, qu'un autre monde est possible. Malheureusement, un des centres de ce autre monde que vous connaissez certainement à la CNUCED, Samir Hamid, est parti. Et on a de moins en moins de personnes à même d'avoir le courage de parler et de mobiliser et de râler même, dirais-je, jusqu'à ce que tout le monde entende et qu'on arrête de penser que plus nous avons dans notre poche, plus nous serons heureux. Il faudrait que tout le monde puisse être heureux ensemble. Je pense que cela est possible. Et ce discours, il faut qu'on l'entende de plus en plus sans que ce soit un discours religieux.
Est-ce que ça doit être, ou ça peut être, un discours mobilisateur dans une campagne électorale, par exemple? Vous-même, vous êtes un élu. Est-ce que vous utilisez peut-être cet argument dans une campagne électorale?
On essaye d'utiliser ces arguments dans une campagne électorale. Mais comme vous le savez, nous sommes des partis quasi marginaux parce que nous n'avons pas les moyens de faire du lobbying. Vous allez à Berne, il y a plein de lobbyistes. Vous avez des lobbyistes partout dans le monde, même au niveau international. C'est ceux-là qui font un tout petit peu la loi. Comment pouvons-nous comprendre que des personnes acceptent de payer plus pour leurs assurances alors qu'ils peuvent payer moins? Et que ceux qui les font payer plus sont ceux qui font la campagne pour aller prendre dans leur poche. on est dans cette situation, la politique est quelque chose d'assez complexe, où quand vous êtes habillé propre en cravate, on n'imagine pas un seul instant que vous êtes un gangster. Mais quand vous venez proposer une solution alternative, on se dit, il ne doit pas être très sérieux celui-là. Voilà. C'est un tout petit peu ça, de façon presque triviale, mais c'est ainsi que cela se passe. Le discours dans le champ politique des populistes est plus facilement audible. Le discours des personnes un tout petit peu plus extrémistes, on les entend. Et quand vous essayez d'être raisonnable en disant, pour les ODD, il nous faudra pouvoir les atteindre, mais en mettant des actions sur tel et tel point, on vous dit que vous êtes un rêveur. Et je pense qu'il faut quand même de l'utopie si l'on veut atteindre un peu le bien-être mondial à quel niveau que ce soit. Voilà.
Alors, merci, Monsieur Jimaja, d'être à la fois un rêveur et un utopiste, et je dirais un rêveur très pragmatique, puisque vous allez maintenant même nous quitter pour aller défendre un budget très intéressant pour obtenir des fonds. Donc, merci pour votre participation. Bonne chance pour votre obtention de fonds, et à très bientôt, j'espère. Thank you so much. So we can continue maybe in English this discussion. Mr. Jimaja was speaking about lobbies, about political will. How can we convince really the people who are supposed to decide not only at political but also at economical level? Monsieur Queisser de Stockalper, how would you convince somebody from the IMF, the World Bank, to say that it is so important to take the lead with this new approach? Is it realistic or is it a simple utopia?
No, I think it's totally realistic. If you look actually at the general infrastructure, you have actually new dimension emerging. And we spoke about finance, we spoke about risk, we spoke about social inclusion, we spoke about climate. But we have data and the digital space emerging. And I think this is actually a key opportunity. And the new president of the World Bank is coming from that world, from MasterCard, and he actually brought MasterCard into the digital space. So I think the idea is to leverage digitalization as a way actually to initiate a new dialogue. And maybe to rebound on the comments of Ms. Grynspan early on about actually politics and the way maybe finance can work together. I think we need to, let's say, re-engineer risk, and this is where financial innovation can be very interesting. But we need also to re-engineer the way we build trust into our system. And of course, digitalization can be, let's say, a big opportunity for that. Why? Because you have traceability of data. That data can go beyond traditional economics data. It can go into natural data. It can go into biodiversity data. It can be into social inclusion data. And all these type of things could be levers to address the historical risks that actually Ms. Grynspan mentioned, to maybe enable capital to go where it didn't go before, which is the last mile. And this is actually where I think financial and technology innovation could be very interesting.
Madame Grynspan, is it difficult for you as a former vice president of a country in Latin America, Central America, and now a Secretary General of UNCTAD? Do you approach the same way the question of sustainable economy or green economy?
Well, you know, I come from a country that was a pioneer on sustainable development and that has really proven that you can have a win-win agenda. Mm-hmm. And that is my drive, in a way. You know, it's the experience of my country that has driven my passion to sustainable development. Because Costa Rica would have not been able to be where it is in terms of development if it was not because of sustainability and our commitment to sustainability very early on. You know, Costa Rica protected 25% of its territory in the 70s. When I was Vice Minister of Finance, we were already in the 80s. Making a proof and error for reforestation. And Costa Rica has today more green coverage than it had in the 80s. Yes, we did. We learned from our mistakes, and we, at the end, were able to put the right policies in place. Now, this is not a given. It's something that you have to, take care of every day, like democracy, like politics. Yes, you have to take. That there is not one thing forever. You need really to pay attention all the time to this. But Costa Rica is a good example. Mm-hmm. Yes. Now, one element that I learned that was important for my country to be able to do that is that for a long time, we had a long-term view, a national project that was widely shared by the population, independently of the political game or the political dynamics of the country. And I feel that one of the things that we don't have today is a long-term view. When we talk about populism, it's because the quick fixes, yes, that everybody thinks that they can implement to solve a problem. And there are no quick fixes in development. And there are no quick fixes in sustainability. You need to be perseverant. You have to take a long-term view. You have to understand that financing is not for 1 month or 1 year. You have to commit for 20 years of transformation. And that is, in a way, what the system also is lacking in terms of the incentives. What are the incentives for long-term? I ask myself, before in politics, there were the political parties, but the political parties are disseminated. We have newcomers that come, with a group that nobody have thought of before and winning the elections. Yes, so there is the political system rewards today the short term over the long term. And we need to think about it because there is no possibility of the transformation of the world, and that's why we are seeing so many populist, examples, if we don't have a long-term view. But the same is with capital. Mm-hmm. The same is in the private sector. We have the incentives of the stock market, for example. Mm-hmm. A CEO that won't be in the company in the next 20 years, he would just want to maximize his salary today. So he plays with the stakeholders to make that happen. Yes? How are we going to make it possible for the public companies that are going to the stock market to really have the long term of the company at heart? For sustainability, you need that. Yes, you need that commitment, and you need that policies that will go beyond 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. And with civil society, that is probably where my hopes lie, in a way, because parents will think about their children, and you want to make the best of your country and your society for a better life for the future, and maybe that's where that's why my hopes lie in civil society. But it's true that civil society has been manipulated by the polarization of the networks, of the social networks, yes, where many of the people will read only what they already think. The things that already will, confirm their beliefs. And so the possibility of a transparency dialogue, yes, of science and evidence to come into the dialogue, the social dialogue and the political dialogue shrinks. And that is the major risk, isn't it? It's true that part of the problem of private capital, like Derek said, is the perception of risk in the countries and in the small countries. But it's also true that there are no incentives in the system to change the indicators, to change the perceptions. And so that is probably my last word. You know, if we cannot include in the system incentives for sustainability, that means long-term vision, it will be very difficult to change the present situation.
Before we give the floor to the audience, Derek, what would be for you the element, the argument that could really convince the CEO of a stock exchange or a bank?
Well, I think there is not one reason why, but I think to just rebound on Rebeca's comments, I think it's important to realize that actually what we see is top of the iceberg, which is really the public markets, see the Nestle's or let's say the Coca-Colas of this world. But I think actually a lot of things are happening under the sea, which is really in the private markets. And people have to understand more than 2/3 of, let's say, global revenues are driven by private companies, family-owned companies, or let's say early-stage companies, or later-stage, but still private. Why do I mention this? Because actually I do see in that field a big change of strategy, for the reason you just mentioned. The rules of the game are shifting. Why? Because you include now, regulatory-wise, actually need to address your negative externalities in the environment, climate, biodiversity, or social inclusion. So people know that down the road, you will need a business that will follow those rules. So people are starting to change early those type of business models. And I'm going to take two examples. One is a very hardcore private equity group in the US called KKR, which is actually, maybe people might be familiar with it, the barbarians at the gate. They were really the ones who were kind of putting a lot of debt on the company to kind of optimize the revenues for their, let's say, stakeholders. About 10 years ago, they decided to change their incentive system in the company they invest in. And they decided actually to let actually employees share a small percentage on the upside of their investments. So that means they were indirect shareholders of the company. So they were, of course, would receive the revenues, let's say, an upside based on the number of years they were in the company. So they were about 8 years in the company, if I remember well. And at the beginning, they thought it would be maybe $15,000, $20,000 bonus. At the end, every single employee that was there from the beginning received $800,000. So what I'm saying is not the number, but it's that someone, let's say, like a hardcore capitalist, is starting to introduce this type of incentive system. Why? Well, maybe, let's say, they think about the legacy, that's one point. But I think the second point is more about risk and incentives, so that actually people, let's say, behave like a community, like a tribe, driving actually to the same goal. Another example is, for example, in the public-private space, is the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. Maybe you're familiar with it. It was started by two foundations, the Paul Allen Foundation in the US and the Foundation of the Prince Albert of Monaco here in Switzerland and Monaco. And the idea was actually to develop a new governance system to bring public-private funds together in order to protect coral reefs globally. And of course, the communities, coastal communities. They started about 7 years ago, and the aim is to raise $500 million to deploy on one side, and say, to preparing the regulatory space, so it's more traditional development finance, but on the other side, actually through private equity and venture capital investments to support new products, services, technologies, business models that protect corals and their communities. And this is really something which is getting traction, because you had two foundations at the beginning, then 4 countries came along, then the UN, of course, was there from the beginning. Another project is within the UN. So what I'm saying is 2 concrete examples that things are changing under the sea of the iceberg. And that's why I'm really optimistic.
Do you agree, Madam Secretary General?
Absolutely. Those are very, very good examples. And are examples that it can be done. So maybe we can end with a positive note, no? In the sense that the world has the resources, it has the technologies, and it has the examples of how to make it work. We need the scale of the commitment to get, and to be honest, the commitment to be honest. So transparency is very, very important. We need the scale, and we need the political will, because we need the regulatory frameworks to help the scale to get there. We need the transparency, so the commitments will be real, and there will be no window dressing, yes, or greenwashing or whatever. So we need the systems to really call the commitments for to be met, and we need the political will to face the pressures of the interest groups that don't want this agenda to succeed. So if we can really put this together, I think that we can be much more optimistic that the world can go this way and can make not only a green transition, but also a just and equitable one.
Thank you very much. Would you say a last word before we give the floor to the audience for questions?
Yes, of course. I think from experience, of course, trust, of course, is key. Transparency, traceability, and engagement, I think, also walking the talk. And second, and that's from what I've experienced, innovation is a great narrative, actually, to bring people together, because we have actually a higher purpose. And through innovation, people understand actually why they need to change, why they can maybe collaborate differently, and why they should maybe accept new solutions. And I'm a strong believer in those two concepts. And this is true that Geneva is actually an amazing hub for that, because actually it's where trust could be built in some kind of a neutral, at least diverse way. And innovation, because look, Switzerland doesn't have actually traditional resources. They had to really innovate to survive, develop, and engage globally. And I think that's a great decentralized democracy approach, which actually can maybe reconnect with the trust component.
Thank you very much. Isabelle, I give you the floor back. Mesdames et messieurs, si vous avez une question, nous sommes ouverts aux questions. Oui, monsieur, Isabelle va vous apporter le micro. Voilà. Et après, monsieur.
Oui, bonjour. Bonjour. En quelle langue voulez-vous la question, en français ou en anglais?
Peut-être en anglais, puisque les deux personnes comprennent l'anglais et le parlent.
Thank you very much for these very convincing interventions, but I have a question. If you look at sustainable green finance, as the name, on the ground level, on the level of the consumer, on the level of normal people, you see that all this good intention and all this goodwill, willingness to enhance the system and to make it better is still deeply flawed by many gaps in the functioning of the system. I mean, to be precise, if you want to invest as normal people in an investment fund that is labeled green, for instance, no firearms, no weapons, no oil, no coal, etc. You have a broad choice, but if you examine the details of the financial product, you see that in your fund, you'll still find tobacco, you'll still find big oil, you'll still find big coal and all this unsavory stuff. So how do you explain that it is still possible, especially in Europe where the regulatory framework is the most advanced in the world, that it is still existing, and how it would not destroy the confidence the public is due to give to that kind of product? So I'm Yves Genier, I'm a business journalist in Geneva.
Who wants to answer this question?
I can start if you want. First, thank you for the question, and I agree from the perspective you take, which is really these kind of quoted public companies, which are legacy companies and actually have to transform themselves, and that takes time. I've always taken the approach that I prefer to to support the last member of the class to become average, as opposed to the second becoming first, because on average, the last becoming average will have a big impact on the system. So it will take time. But I agree with you, the narrative is flawed because people are investing in ESG products thinking they're going to change the world or save it, which is not the case. They're just going to be sure that those companies are not excessive in their behavior. And I think this is something that people have to understand. Of course, they're helping go in the right direction, but it is not that will make a, let's say, a true difference in the short term. In the medium term to long term, as you mentioned, yes. What I would focus on is really on outcome investments, meaning that actually you invest in products and services that support an outcome. And that outcome could be reduction of carbon emissions, could be bigger social inclusion, could be other type of externalities. And this today has to really be done from the ground up, meaning you have to invest in innovation. For example, we invest in a company that transforms biomass waste not into energy, but into green chemical building blocks, so that you capture carbon and then transform, let's say, the supply chains by replacing fossil-based products. So this is where you have real outcome investment opportunities. And then, of course, you need to scale it. And that's another challenge, because we come again in the concept of risk. Because people would tell you, oh, I love your narrative, I love this innovation, but when they have to deploy the capital, suddenly they, boom, put back their normal hat and then actually evaluate those opportunities as being traditional opportunities. So I think there's still this narrative gap. But to answer to your question, I think you're focusing on the top of the iceberg, which I totally agree, but you should really look underneath at all that is happening and is really transforming our system from within. And I will go back again in the dimension of digitalization and data, because this becomes actually an amazing platform to trace what is happening, and if you trace, you can measure. If you can measure, you can then manage risk.
Mme Grynspan?
Yes, no, I agree with both. And I think that it is really a challenge for an investor that wants to be responsible. It is a challenge. First of all, it's very complex. Yes, for the reasons that the gentleman said. You know, you think you gave very clear instructions to invest in, in clean industries or in clean products, and then you discover that still, many of the bads of the world are included in those funds. So I think that Derek said something that is very, very important. First of all, you have to trace. You need, for example, we have put together an observatory for greenwashing, yes, in terms of the ESG, so the environment and social and governance aspects. So I think that we need much more social auditing, would you say, on the capital markets to guide your investment much better for those investors that want to be responsible. And the other thing that I very much appreciated from what Derek said is this issue of changing not only the narrative, but what you look at. We are looking in the wrong place, yes? I remember this joke about a drunk that was looking for the keys, yes? And he was looking for the keys in a farola, in a light in the street. And one person that passed by asked him, what are you looking for? He said, oh, my keys. Did you lose your keys here? The person asked. And he said, no, but it's the only place where there is light. So we are looking for the keys in the wrong place. Only because there is the light, but there is, the mechanisms are easier there than where they should be. Yes, and I think that Derek referred to that in very good terms. And my third point is that you need the incentives to open the new markets, the new products, and the new ideas. The innovation system also needs the incentives to disincentivize the old. And that's what we don't have in place. The incentives for the old are still there. And we saw it with the Ukraine war, yes, where many went back to invest on oil, in carbon, etc., in Europe. That is the leader of the sustainability narrative, yes? So how to disincentivize the old? And we don't have, we economists have a response to that, is the price carbon, the taxes to the externalities, yes? But we know how difficult this has been to implement. We haven't been able to put not the taxes and not the prices for the harm that the old is making to all of us in place. And that is still, you know, the agenda that we haven't been able to comply with.
Mm-hmm. There was a question here, sir.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Alejandro Bonilla. I'm former ILO official, and I'm president of GRACELS, the Association of Former UN Officials for Development. Well, really, thank you very much. It was really very enlightening what you said. I'm not an economist, I'm an actuary, and I have been working in pensions and health all my life. So the long term is what I do. And the patient is really what I want to do. I want to look at. Mrs. Grynspan mentioned that we have to make the link between the green sustainability, economic sustainability, and social sustainability. But there's a link that I think there's still missing. It's a link between the first world, the second world, and the third world. Sometimes I think that we are like in the Titanic, and the third world, the first world is still with the violins and the good food, and say, well, those guys in the second section and the third one, they have a problem. It's not, we all have a problem, and you mentioned an iceberg. We're going just in front, and we don't assure the global sustainability, and that leads to demographics. You have one country with one name, but behind one country you can have 10,000 people, or 300 million, or more than 1 billion. So demographics count. And I had the privilege also to live in Costa Rica, and I think that we really have to go to the basics. In all my experience, the best results in sustainability were based on the education of the country. And in Costa Rica, it's so remarkable because they have an extraordinary education system, an extraordinary democracy. And I have a problem, and I fear democracy now. We all see that if democracy works, the sign will go from right to left to center to right to left to center if it's work. But that it's a risk for sustainability. And you see that now we see what's going on in Argentina, for example, with a big change. And we are waiting what is going to happen in the United States because there will be a big change. So is democracy a threat to sustainability? Or what kind of democracy and education we need so that it's not a threat?
Thank you for your question.
Well, thank you very much for your question. I think it's a very fundamental and structural one because I wrote some books on the concept of reciprocity as a way to address needs. And the idea was to say that actually our socioeconomic structures were structured to address you and I, our family's needs. And we needed to do that to have protection from the group, and we needed to have a tool to access those needs. And I think what is very interesting is actually over millennia, we had actually 3 reciprocity mechanisms. One was the gift economy, then barter, and now it's a monetary system. The challenge with the monetary system is that actually it creates purely competitive dynamics, while the first 2 have also some collaborative dynamics. So to balance this out, we had to create a social contract, which kind of defined rules where actually we protected each other in order to support each other. And then, of course, institutions, constitutions, and other tools emerged. But I think what is happening, and I think that's why your question is very interesting, is that actually we're moving from actually a game where states, the name, as you mentioned, then maybe organizations, which are kind of linked to this globalization dynamic of the last 30 years, are being complemented by individuals, you and me. Why? Because actually we have access to data. We have phones, we have social networks, we have money, which is actually the second kind of social contract, the economic one, you have the political one, and potentially new opportunities to have access not only to information but to revenues. And this is maybe actually what we might be going in the future, is that fragmentation of revenues to maybe disintermediation of maybe revenues, which could be an opportunity maybe to address some of the challenges we have, because it's true, we cannot speak about climate without speaking about social inclusion, because we need that security. That's actually why a social contract emerged. The trade-off was, okay, I will not be alone in the forest, anarchy, if I'm protected by the community. But today, a lot of people are not protected by the community anymore. So the working poor is one example, the fragility of the middle class in developed and developing countries. So I think we need to find new tools, and this is where innovation again could be an angle, among others, of course, to look at.
Mrs. Grynspan, is or can democracy be a threat for and to sustainability? And what kind of democracy do we want? Do we want a democracy where maybe the big companies have an influence on the decisions for the people? You have been vice president. How would you tackle this question about democracy and sustainability?
You know, first of all, let me say that democracy doesn't get everything right, but at least we have the right to change it. You know, it will be much worse to be in a place where the decisions are wrong and you don't have the possibility to change it. Yes? So that's a basic point to support democracy. Yes, not because it does everything right, not because the system doesn't have interest groups, not because it cannot be co-opted. It's because at the end, we can organize ourselves to change it. Yes? And I think that that is the main point that we have to remember. You know, I am a fan of democracy, but I recognize that there is diversity in the world, and that probably, let me say this carefully maybe, but probably the market was more successful than democracy. You know, we thought in the past that when we will have more free markets, yes, we will have also inevitably more democracy. If you had more economic freedoms, you will have also more political freedoms. And that didn't happen. So we have to learn from the dynamics of politics and from the, how would you say, the mistrust that is coming from citizenship towards the political structures that are posing a challenge to democracy. But, you know, I will respect all political systems because that's what multilateralism is about, yes, with the basis of human rights and that the UN have and international law, but I will always be a voice for democracy all over systems. There is no perfect system, but democracy probably is the only one that we can change.
Thank you very much. The floor is back to Isabelle Falconier.
Yeah, I think maybe we have time for, no, we don't have time for, thank you. So we don't have time for another question, but you will stay with us for a few more minutes around a coffee or sandwich. So thank you very much online for those following the talk today. Thank you very much, Derek, Rebecca. Well, enjoy Davos, if that's something we can wish you. Merci beaucoup, Louisa, pour ce panel. Madame, Monsieur, merci pour votre attention. Bonne suite de semaine. Thank you so much.
Merci. Merci beaucoup.